if you're not sure what to do in the future, find a solution and take initiative. And we've really lost so much initiative where people say, well, I can't do that because someone else should do that though. Well, why not? Why can't you be the one to make change? When you think about the candlelight revolution in communist Romania that overthrew their government, it started with people holding candles in public squares and vigils. And eventually it overthrew one of the most brutal and dictatorial governments that Europe has ever seen.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds, where we seek to bring accountability to our government. I am Stephanie Weidel. Please go ahead and subscribe to our channels, check out our social media, including our Substack, and share these podcast episodes. Please join with me in prayer for those in North Carolina and Tennessee who have been devastated by the recent hurricane. Do consider donating to the organizations who are providing rescue and supplies. There are many, including Samaritan's Purse, which is headquartered in Boone, North Carolina. And also, we have a very generous Feds for Freedom donor who has agreed to match dollar for dollar up to $10,000 in support of our organization. So please consider a donation this month, an early end-of-the-year gift to Feds for Freedom, so we can continue our mission towards government accountability and reform. You can do so by visiting our website, fedsforfreedom.org.
Welcome to The Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
This week, I sit down with Cameron Hamilton, former Navy SEAL and Department of Homeland Security's Director of Health Services. He is a former guest on this podcast and also Feds for Freedom's new Vice President. Thank you so much for joining me today, Cameron. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Also newly appointed as the Vice President of Feds for Freedom.
I was just about to say that.
Tremendous honor.
Yes. So tell us about that. How did that come about?
Well, I worked at DHS in the State Department before that, and I've always been involved in the federal workforce in some capacity. When the lockdowns happened and when we saw some of the draconian kind of government theories on what would entail the vaccines, the mandates, would they force this on the entire federal workforce? That's when I became aware of the group that had been founded by Marcus and several others, Feds for Medical Freedom at the time. Really compelling. It's hard to discern what's true and what's not. You see some groups that are founded with virtuous principles and they lose their way. Other groups, are really kind of the shell. They don't really mean the things that they advocate for. Feds for Medical Freedom, I was astonished at the mission, the focus, and really their purpose was about caring for people. And that's very much what's been driving me to be a public servant most of my adult life, caring for others, being a true and diligent servant of greater humanity. So I joined the group, and it wasn't long after joining the group that I met Marcus and met several others. They asked me to be one of two class agents to represent DHS employees bringing suit against the federal government from Executive Order 14043. Now, we'll unpack some of that a little bit very briefly, but the executive order that was instilled had a lot of implications in other areas, such as, for example, testing protocols. It wasn't just that employees had to get vaccinated. It was also, those who were not vaccinated had to adhere to different testing prerogatives versus those who were. Disparate treatment based upon perceived medical disabilities, a lot of legitimate legal challenges that were not being addressed. General counsel across various departments were really ignoring the issue and the grievances that were being sought. So I had the tremendous honor of joining Feds for Medical Freedom, helping out Marcus and the board of directors. Over time, again, they prevailed with this tremendous victory in the Fifth Circuit. It took quite a while to get there. For those of you that know about the organization, I'm sure you have a good breadth of the history, but the long and short is, through successive layers of bureaucracy, they were able to achieve a nationwide injunction where the appeals court then overturned the injunction, but then the en banc ruling overturned the appeals court ruling. A really remarkable judicial precedent that had not been seen very often. So after my campaign, since Feds for Freedom now, the new name, because it focuses on an even broader mission, they're prohibited from being involved in political processes where they explicitly endorse candidates or where they advocate for a particular candidate versus another. So since my campaign is now over, Marcus and the team, Jim and many others. I was incredibly honored that they asked me to join the board, and not only to do that, but to join as the vice president. So here I am now. It's a tremendous privilege, and thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for joining me.
Of course.
So let's talk about your campaign. On this podcast, we've talked before about the deep state,
right,
quite a bit. And we see it more and more, the presence of this invisible government, invisible body behind the scene government. How did you see the deep state's existence in your campaign?
That's a really wonderful question. Really, really wonderful question. By the way, I love it.
Oh, yeah. Aren't they great? That's a shout out to Nicole in California who donated these.
I love them.
Yes.
So the deep state. You have the Prime Minister Blair used to talk about the administrative state within Great Britain. And it's kind of an interesting theory to break down. It's become a hot topic word. It's become really a term unto itself that has a very specific meaning. But not everyone's definition of what the deep state entails is exactly the same. What I will say is there's inclusive circles or inner circles of control and influence that have sway. From my perspective, much of what you see in the federal government, politically as well as non-politically, is not so much a grand conspiracy. It's instead individual entities with competitive interests seeking to be cooperative for a common goal. So it can have the interpretation of, a secret society, and those things do exist, but it's really more like feudal Europe, where there are many different competitive interests, which at times overlap and at times don't overlap. What I experienced specifically in my campaign was compelling interest from a few different parties, and I'll break them down real quick. Number one, you have the National Republican Congressional Caucus. That is the party of which I was assigned and which I am proud, again, to have been a lifelong Republican. Growing up in California, we were Reagan Republicans. It's really more of a live and let live, very libertarian-esque. You mind your own business, I'll mind my own business. Let's just be civil and get along and respect each other's rights and autonomy and keep the government out of the way. And really, most Americans actually, aside from the political parties, agree with that narrative. I had to engage with the NRCC. In addition to the NRCC, I also had to engage with different members of the House, not only the staff. I also had to engage with the Republican Party of Virginia and many others, as well as local parties. And that, the Tea Party movement, you have many other different entities which all play inside this kind of spectrum. I will tell you, one of the best ways to ostracize yourself politically is by speaking the truth, even when it goes against a common narrative. We've seen this with Dr. Malone. We've seen this with Dr. McCullough. We've seen this with RFK Jr. We've seen this with so many key individuals, even Russell Brand. I mean, for crying out loud, look at what he's saying on stage now. Jordan Peterson, canceled from so many academic circles in Canada. Those who dare to think critically and to provide substantive feedback, even when it might be contentious, are really pushed aside very quickly by individuals or organizations which seek to have more control. I was perceived as a candidate with less control because I spoke very unapologetically about key issues. For example, many of Republicans in the House of Representatives have supported the continuation of FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I was radically opposed to it based upon serious constitutional concerns over the abuse of power and documented cases of nearly 300,000 violations of Americans' privacy. I was asked to tone those comments down. I also—
Wait, who asked you?
Asked by key staff members within Republican leadership. I don't want to implicate specific names, but I can tell you that these are staff members for current representatives, as well as individual staff members assigned to specific committees on the House of Representatives who dared to bring up the idea that, well, if you create waves on this topic, you may not get a certain committee assignment should you win. So there was a lot of influence.
And so how did you respond to them?
Respectfully, I told them to pound sand, which probably was not the best tactic, albeit I didn't prevail in my primary. Clearly, I came up short with votes, although it was a very close, very expensive primary.
But you were exactly what is needed.
Well, thank you. Of course, I'm very biased, but I'm honored to hear you say that. I would think that right now, what we are craving is a sense of decency, but also just sincerity. People have to mean what they say. If you look at the recent debate between J.D. Vance and Governor Walz, uh, without endorsing a candidate, there was clearly one candidate who was more comfortable, who was more at ease, and who spoke about family values and key attributes of what governance would look like with his leadership in a way that many Americans could relate to. And so I think there's no surprise seeing what the outcome of that debate was and who was the clear winner. Overwhelmingly, even the New York Times has indicated that J.D. Vance was by far the best performer of that debate. I think people are craving that. J.D. Vance is a very peculiar legislator because, again, he's not been a perfect mold of Mitch McConnell in the Senate. He's broken away from the mold on key issues. He dared early on with the mandates and the lockdowns to question the authenticity of many of our public officials over why are we closing businesses? Why are we intruding ourselves into people's lives? He had a big picture perspective of what's the end state we're trying to achieve here? This is not blessable. This is not a positive outcome. So really remarkable that he's rose to such prominence, especially being selected by Donald Trump as his running mate, because he connects with the average American in a much more tangible way. Part of the reason why his story, Hillbilly Elegy, was such a compelling story that people loved and why it took off. So I represented a very similar characteristic in my race of just true grassroots American principled conservatism, but without the political labels. And I will tell you, I went to Democratic and Republican meetings and talking, venues and different debate forums and things like that. And I will say, as the ultra right wing conservative that I was labeled as, I connected with moderates and independents far more than most people gave me credit for, because they realized we just like someone who's willing to criticize not only the opposing party, but even your own party when we get it wrong. That healthy dose of skepticism is something we inherited from England. You find it in their humor, you find it in their culture. And so that's been very much inculcated in American culture. We need that in politics now.
Yeah, skepticism has gone out the window.
Yeah, totally.
But what would you say to people who are skeptical of high up Republicans?
Mm-hmm.
And we're not a political organization,
Correct.
we're a nonprofit, but we have a right to be very skeptical of everyone right now.
I will tell you with firsthand knowledge, I have spoken to members who are Democrats currently serving in our legislature. Again, the three co-equal branches of government. Our legislature enacts and makes law. They also fund the government. I've spoken with Democrats and Republicans currently serving in the House and the Senate who have told me to my face that they cannot vote on a certain bill or with a certain ideological perspective, which they share, because it would create such chaos for their donor. It would create such chaos with party leadership. And again, I wish I could tell you this was one party. It's not. You see it prevailing within really every enclave of the Democratic and Republican Party machine.
So in your experience, who make up those donors? I mean, what are their interests?
There's a lot of donors who are really remarkable people. Again, I amassed, I think we raised a fairly substantive amount of money, and I had so much support all across the country, but also in the Commonwealth. Most of my donors were small, $20, $25, and those are just everyday Americans that are just wanting to contribute. You also have mega donors, people that bundle donations. They bring in their friends, they'll donate the max, and then they'll bring in 25 other people. It really depends. Some have competitive interests as it pertains to their business model. Some want to see legislation passed on this issue or that issue. So they hope that by sponsoring candidates, you'll be more favorable to their perspective. I hate to say it, but it is sort of a pay-for-play game. And I very much tried to push back on that in virtually every way that I could. It made me enemies at times. It made me allies at others. It was really quite remarkable. So I'll tell you that the biggest flaw that I see in much of our legislature is we have a governing body that wants to be liked. They want to get approvals. They want to be on the board of directors of this firm. They want to be invited to speak at commencement speeches for college graduations. They want to be special appointed guests of honorees and on these societies and different entities that praise them publicly. They're not devious people. They just have a desire to be liked by others. And unfortunately, that desire causes a compromising of many of their convictions and values. So I saw this in Republican circles as well as in Democrat circles, which is why I was advised to stay away from key or controversial topics, or if I spoke about them, to mute my perspective in a way that would be palatable, not so much to achieve victory, but to achieve compliance and uniformity within a party narrative. Anything that was contrary to a party narrative, for example, the omnibus spending bills or things like that, which I found to be fiscally irresponsible, I was very much encouraged to be very mild with my criticism of even Republican leadership over failure to pass meaningful legislation and failure to pass substantive bills that actually engaged in fiscal restraint. So it's to those Americans who are disenfranchised, I will tell you, there's nothing more powerful than the local committee. So wherever you are, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a Republican, if you're an independent, being involved in state and local politics, I think is the starting and the next point of everywhere. Are you kids in public school? Mine are not, but that's a whole nother issue. Having said that, are you involved in the school boards? Are you involved with your board of supervisors? They set your tax rates for your municipalities. They talk about key funding projects and economic development. Are you getting involved there? You should be. And then from there, do you build your way up? Are you talking to your state delegate, your state representatives, your state senators? Are you seeing what legislation passes at the state and local level and then working your way up to the federal level? Unfortunately, the media cycle that we're in prioritizes federal politics in a way that's disproportionately out of balance, I think, with what actually affects the average American on a day-to-day basis. It's time we correct the draconian measures that happened in the lockdowns. Those did not come from the federal government. Those came from state governments.
That's right.
They came from governors and they came from state bodies that failed to ensure limitations on power. Now, the employee mandate that we fought against specifically here, that was a unique federal authority. But again, it was challenged. And one of the reasons I think it succeeded is because we did have states like Florida, Kentucky, and a few others that pushed back against this abuse of federal overreach and said, National Guard service, Texas, Oklahoma, even Nebraska, I think, National Guard service members that are under the federal umbrella will not have to comply with this federal mandate. We had states, strong and powerful governors and legislators step up to push back on the abuses of an unbalanced federalism. And that's what I think you have to be this cohesive political process that's totally unique, this strange constitutional republic that we have that, frankly, the world had never seen before the United States.
So let's talk about some key campaigns this election season. We're just a couple weeks away from the election. I think one of them, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the 7th District of Virginia. And we have Derek Anderson, who was your opponent, who is the Republican nominee and very establishment. And then you have Eugene or Yevgeny Vindman, who is Ukrainian, has ties in Ukraine. So tell us more about this and tell us more about Vindman. His name is very familiar on this podcast. He's the one that signed Mark Bashaw's court-martial papers.
That's correct. And bragged about it online. It wasn't just that he prosecuted him. He actually bragged about it. He thought it was virtuous. The Virginia 7th is, of course, where I live. I live in Orange, Virginia. The resting place of James Madison, a great place. It's a strange makeup of counties. It's 11 counties, or 10 plus a sliver of another. And so Derek Anderson beat me in the Republican primary. There were 7 of us actually running or 6 of us running the Republican primary.
Why do you think he beat you?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I was outspent. I think also Mr. Anderson carried the endorsement of the Speaker of the House, Speaker Mike Johnson. That carries significant political weight and emphasis. I had members that I spoke to who actually were very sympathetic to my ideals and to my perspective, who were very apprehensive to engage with me because of the concern of pushing against party leadership. So I was also endorsed by members of the Freedom Caucus, which are perceived publicly now as a bit more radical than the average Republican, fighting much more seriously for constitutional limitations of power, fiscal reform, securing the southern border. But the Freedom Caucus has been labeled as the group that ousted Kevin McCarthy. So there was a lot of infighting within the Republican Party. Now, to be clear, of those that voted to remove Kevin McCarthy, Only 4 of them were from the Freedom Caucus. The other 4 were not. So it's unfair to say that this was a Freedom Caucus element. It really wasn't. Having said that, there were, in fact, some of the most prominent members of the Freedom Caucus spoke in defense of Kevin McCarthy, like Jim Jordan and many others who were very prominent members, who great constitutional legislators. Having said that, I was sort of labeled in a category that pushed me more to the extremes of the party in a way that was a bit unpalatable by many. So I think I was outspent and outsupported. Mr. Anderson had it's 70 endorsements. I had approximately 25. His carried much more national weight than mine did. And so it's without repudiating all the ills and do's and don'ts of the election campaign, there were things that both he and I did that we probably should not have done. The primary became very contentious and things were said back and forth. Nonetheless, I did not prevail because I didn't have the votes. I didn't have the ability to get my message out quite as effectively as Mr. Anderson was. And that's really what politics is about. That's what a lot of the money and donations go to. Television advertisements, mailers, voting events where you can connect with people and constituents to convey a message in hopes that they hear, they resonate, and they vote, and they compel and bring other people to vote as well.
You know, of all the 231 signatories of the Declaration of Military Accountability, 10 of them were running for office. One, I believe, actually made it through his primary. Two?
Yeah. We have Chris from California, and we also have Commander Jay Furman in Texas.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, good. 2. Mm-hmm. So we have these people of great integrity, but they're not making it into office.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's very difficult.
Even through the primaries.
So you see this even in the Democratic Party with their primaries as well. For example, Yevgeny Vindman, who we just mentioned, raised millions of dollars in that primary. In a way, he frankly raised more money in that primary than Abigail Spanberger did as the incumbent Democratic member of the House of Representatives. Pretty alarming numbers. I mean, we're seeing, the first day he raised almost $1 million. Literally the first day he announced almost $1 million to his campaign. Within the first 2 months, he raised $2.5 million. Unheard of numbers for a non-incumbent. And he was promoted as a celebrity candidate. That made it exceedingly difficult for the other 7 Democrat candidates to try to permeate through that mix. So Vindman won his primary with an overwhelming margin by about 65 or 70% of the votes for that primary. The other candidates simply had an inability to really penetrate through that wall of media engagements and communication. And that's unfortunately what you see so much in politics now. These other 2 individuals, Chris and Jay, who are still running, really remarkable individuals. They're firm believers in a liberty approach to government. That government can be a force for good, but it has limitations. It must have limitations. And so incredibly brave individuals. And we're going to see what happens in November. Again, without endorsing any candidates, we want candidates to enter office who believe in the strictest interpretation of the Constitution, the rule of law, and to ensure maximum freedom, liberty, and prosperity for every American. And I can tell you those 2 definitely embody those characteristics.
Tell me more about Vindman and his celebrity endorsements, and what do you think he's going to be doing once he gets into office?
Right. So, unfortunately, Luke Skywalker has endorsed Eugene Vindman. So Mark Hamill came out.
Star Wars will never be the same now.
I agree. Luke is no longer the chosen one in the Star Wars trilogy. We just have to make that very clear. No, I say that in jest. Vindman has been supported by many others. He and his brother Alexander both made a lot of public notoriety, specifically Alexander by testifying before the House pertaining towards President Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president, where they were talking about what President Trump perceived as corruption in Ukraine and whether or not the United States government should be sending more aid and more resources to bolster Ukrainian defense. And this is prior to a Russian invasion of their border. Alexander Vindman, who was a lieutenant colonel working on the National Security Council with his brother at the same time, they both had a reputation of being very politically biased. I will tell you that Alexander Vindman testified indicating that Trump's policies were divergent from past foreign policy narratives that he thought was of a concern. There is a legitimate grievance process that he can pursue as a federal government employee and as a service member He did not pursue those. Instead, he became a whistleblower and sought to, in my opinion, overly politicize his influence and position to impact the Trump presidency in a negative way. Eugene Vindman was a JAG officer, also working at the National Security Council. He was a military prosecutor. One of the unique things about his service is that when the lockdowns had happened after the 2020 election, President Biden brought about some of the vaccine mandates. Secretary Lloyd Austin required that all service members be obtaining a vaccine. Then there were service members who were concerned over the legality of that decision. Well, Yevgeny Vindman, who is Ukrainian born, came to the United States, immigrated with his family as Jewish refugees that were being persecuted religiously in communist Ukraine back under the USSR legitimately. Having said that, there's some very clear perspectives that he shares on the role and weaponization of government. He was not willing to entertain the notion that perhaps Charles Bashaw or others had a legitimate claim towards the upholding of their religious liberties. Instead, he saw that the state had complete authority to require medical procedures, and that he should celebrate it online when he prosecuted him. So Yevgeny has had a history of behavior that, in my opinion, shows an individual who sees government weaponization of resources for a common narrative as something inherently good. And that should be concerning to any liberty-loving American, whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat. These are very serious constitutional concerns. One of my concerns as a federal government employee during that same time was that almost no general counsel in the government was willing to dissent on the narrative of COVID and on what the role of the government was with mandating procedures. And you can't get general counsel to agree on hardly anything. But all of a sudden, with these mandates, every single lawyer at these federal agencies were in complete agreement. Mm-hmm. That's unheard of. You talk to 10 lawyers, you get 25 different opinions. And so Yevgeny was an individual as a lieutenant colonel who, in my opinion, used and weaponized his position to achieve a legal victory on behalf of the United States, which, by the way, is now under review, and which ultimately we are hoping that Charles Bashaw will be completely cleared of any wrongdoing, and it'll show that, in fact, his rights were being violated. And the grievances he had requested were not being adhered to. The due diligence that the government is required to go through was completely ignored. Really awful.
Where is he in that court case right now? And is it Mark Charles Bashaw or Charles?
Sorry, I believe you're correct. I believe it is Mark Charles Bashaw. If I do get it wrong, Mr. Bashaw, my apologies, my sincere apologies. I owe you a beer, my friend. But nonetheless, that case is still under review because he's filed grievances claiming that his religious as well as legal rights were being violated. And so I don't know exactly where it stands. He has had some headway. Vindman is mentioned as well as others, and they're implicated in that decision because it wasn't just Vindman. Vindman reported to a commanding general who then sought and authorized such behavior and action brought against him. And so I'm not sure all the specifics. I'd love to have him back on at some point and talk to him about where that lies currently. But I can tell you he's one of thousands that are fighting, like Brianna Cespedes. You've had her on. Jordan Carr, Carolyn Rocco. I mean, so many other amazing service members, so many others. Brad Miller, for crying out loud. Brad gave up everything as a lieutenant colonel. I mean, good grief. You talk about the service, the patriotism, and that man stepping away from wearing the uniform because he felt that the job assigned to him was in complete violation of the oath of office he took. That's very esque of some of the implication of leadership that Napoleon writes about in his Maxims. If you disagree with an order, you must state so publicly, and if forced and compelled to do it, you must resign. That is an honorable thing to do. Brad actually took, in my opinion, the very honorable route by resigning. And so there are so many service members that have experienced persecution. Even Ted Macy, again, he was a whistleblower. There are so many individuals who have fought against the abuse of government. And unfortunately, Vindman has a track record of using government resources for political benefit.
Yeah, you know, and I think I'm getting this right. The WHO international health regulations were passed in June. Mm-hmm. And what those do...
Which every American should be concerned about.
Yes, they should, because it gives the powers, if they want it, to the local tyrants. And so that's where someone like Vindman becomes very important. If he has a tyrant bent, he's going to use that, and he's going to point to the IHRs as his justification for his actions.
Yep.
And we're going to be having Meryl Nass on at some point to talk all about the WHO, the UN, and what's going on there.
Yeah.
All people's eyes are on our election,
That's
our
correct.
presidential election coming up. What are the ramifications of this election on we the people?
Yeah, so that's, when you talk about we the people, that was something I used to say in my own campaign. It's about we the people, not politics, because it really is. Unfortunately, so much of our politics is serving of specific bodies, organizations, and or legislative victory, really kind of leaving the people behind. And it's unfortunate. And I wish I could say that's purveyed by one party. It's not. It's weaponized, I think, in many times by both. And that's why so many people become disenfranchised. This is a unique election. We see President Trump, who's not an incumbent, but a formerly serving president. He's running again. He's compelled, and he's picked a compelling candidate to run with him, J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio, up against Kamala Harris, who's the current sitting vice president, who's picked a Governor Walz from Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken. So the point, this is a unique election because neither are technically an incumbent, but Vice President Harris is almost running with some of the incumbent steam, but you wouldn't know that if you listen to some of her talking points. She's running on the notion that we're not going back. We want to envision the future, really trying to distance herself from the current administration, which she serves within. So it's unique. And a lot of things are on the line here. I will tell you, this is specifically a community focused on religious liberty, on personal health freedom. And there are some challenges to contend with as it pertains to this election. If we see President Harris or Vice President Harris, although some people joke that she's the president because they're not sure if President Biden's actually in control and running the White House. I have it on good authority, and I've heard from people that President Biden is not running the country, and that instead it's a community of very like-minded individuals who are responsibly governing and helping President Biden, which as soon as I heard that, I was horrified.
Who are responsibly governing?
Exactly. There's no way to know if that's true or not. The point is, we're living in a strange environment where the current president seems to be mentally declining. Without endorsing a candidate, the fact that I have talked to foreigners across the world who are very clear about what's going on with your White House. I mean, and these are many of them radical progressives who see that you clearly don't have a president with all of his faculties. That's abundantly obvious. So aside from that, President Trump and Vice President Harris portray two very different narratives. Now, President Trump has been courting much more of the liberty-focused perspective on belief in upholding the rule of law, ensuring that personal and religious freedom is defended. President Trump has come out unapologetically many times saying that he wishes to defend Judeo-Christian values. Again, we have much of our government structure, the three branches of government, the innocence until presumed, or the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. All of those are things that you find from the scripture, from Bible. So the point there, he represents much more of an element focused on individual liberty, whereas the Harris administration sees government as an entity which must grow so as to greater serve and correct societal ills. These are challenges, no doubt, that we've seen, especially at a time when our debt is higher than it's ever been before. What rides on the line? I think we have to look at what each presidency would entail. President Trump, while being a strong defender of liberty in many respects, also has quite a bit of implication in Operation Warp Speed.
Yes.
An initiative which many Americans saw as a huge infringement on liberties. Now, the mechanism of bringing government resources to bear to provide medical intervention in a timely basis is a noble cause. But how it was executed and the lack of sincerity with serious both political, philosophical, as well as medical ethical discussions were not really being had. The biggest concerns about the Trump presidency that many on the liberty movement have had is, why didn't you fire Anthony Fauci earlier?
Absolutely.
Knowing how corrupt this man was, knowing that he's not only profiting off many of these vaccines
He's the
personally.
definition of a deep state.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's legitimate concerns over, will a Trump presidency bring those resources back? Now, I will say what we're seeing now in the landscape of politics is the unification of the Trump camp with RFK Jr.
Yeah, that's very
The
interesting.
very pro-liberty, very pro personal freedom, very independent / libertarian-esque. That's a strange development that's kind of new, that the Republican Party has always kind of pushed off, but now is embracing wholeheartedly for a broad coalition, which is really unique. So I think that we'll see a few things different if, one of the key things that he's tasked Bobby Kennedy with doing, and I'm friends with RFK Jr. We've had multiple discussions on this topic. One of the things I think he'll try to do is empower him to deregulate much of our government and to expose some of the corruption and some of the lobbying and financial ties that are really not serving Americans. Instead, they're serving special interests. That's a theme that resonates across every party line. That's part of the reason why I think President Trump was elected in 2016. Hillary Clinton was looked at as someone who was very amalgamous to the deep state in DC, very connected with the inner financial circles, whereas Donald Trump was seen as sort of a radical outsider who brought a business mindset and the willingness to change. That's a compelling message for many Americans, and we saw a huge spillover of people that supported Bernie Sanders vote for Donald Trump. I think we're going to see something similar here now because of the unification of those two movements. And RFK Jr., again, he has positions that I don't agree with on several different topics, but I think he showed a lot of empathy and humility by pulling back and supporting the Trump campaign. So we'll see. We'll see really what it means. The other unfortunate characteristics, though, is we have had Republican leadership in the past decade that's been very egregious with overspending. And that has other implications upon the American people, the economy. So we'll see.
And before we get to the spending, I want to get to North Carolina and what's going on with that.
Oh my gosh.
And the lack of spending on our own people.
Yeah.
But I wish RFK would just smack Trump on the side of the head and say, what are you doing talking about ventilators and how you're the one that put ventilators up when we have evidence that it was ventilators that was killing people?
Yeah, you're right. So I worked in various hospitals. I worked within a very specific program at the State Department. It was a really unique job. We do medical refreshment training and we get our skills refreshed, protecting dignitaries and ambassadors overseas. We go to civilian hospitals, treat patients, working under a very similar set of protocols to a intensive care, PA. But that being said, every hospital has protocols on algorithms that define how long you keep a patient on ventilators and how long you engage in what's called personally stimulated, breath. So the ability to maintain homeostasis and to breathe and to have their own respiratory drive driven by the respiratory rhythmic center in the brain, and how you don't want to impede that too long, because the more you suspend that through the use of products, paralytics, or things of that nature, and then you mechanically take over ventilating a patient, the longer that goes on, the worse impact it has on the human brain in taking over those autonomous functions. Mm-hmm. Again, there are peer research journals that go through this at length, and algorithms and tables that CRNAs that anesthesiologists have to adhere to with get your patient spontaneously breathing as rapidly as possible, get them off ventilatory support. I trained this way. I was a combat medic in the SEAL teams. I trained this way at the State Department, at DHS, managing other EMTs throughout the southern border. When COVID happened, all of those protocols were ignored. We kept patients on ventilators for months. Mm-hmm. And it's just no medical ethics being applied. Very few intensivists and individuals that were looking at respiratory therapy saying, wait a second, we've always told people we can't put individuals on ventilatory support for this long. Why are we doing it now? Why, in fact, are we sedating people when they have the ability to breathe, losing their ability to autonomously respirate, and pushing them potentially closer to this cliff? So I will tell you, I think RFK Jr.'s comments are appropriate, because ventilators are great for a patient who loses respiratory ability for homeostasis, but they should not be pushed on patients. Mm-hmm. I can tell you during COVID, they were.
Yes.
All the emphasis and pressure was on ventilators and other treatment forms rather than finding, and we also saw places like Colorado where people who were playing outside were put in jail because they were throwing a football outside. That was when I saw early on in the pandemic, okay, this is a fraud. This is government corruption. This is control. This is not actually about helping people, because I think the United States should have taken lessons from Sweden or other nations that said those who are medically fragile should, of course, isolate themselves from society. but we're not going to bring society to a halt. In fact, we want people to go outside, get fresh air. All medical ethics and research have shown that over time, yet all of a sudden we ignored it during a pandemic. I find that very odd.
Yes.
I find that conspicuous. So these are legitimate concerns that I think many Americans, if they're supporting President Trump, we hope are weeding out. The problem is much of the leverage and authority that was used across this country in the United States was done so by governors. And some of the more heavily progressive governors weaponized their resources very, very aggressively and have really not even made a mea culpa. They've not made a public repudiation of past efforts. In fact, many times they've defended their records in locking people down, which now I think a preponderance of evidence has shown actually worsen things socially, medically, you name it.
All right. So let's talk about we the people and the climate of the people. We have just seen a disaster, a catastrophe in North Carolina,
Awful.
and in Tennessee.
Yeah.
My uncle is a pastor in Montreat. He lives in Black Mountain. He is very affected by this. Fortunately, he was not there. He was visiting family in Colorado. So, but complete Swannanoa is completely buried in mud.
Yeah.
The news is not covering this as they should. I was sharing a couple things with you beforehand that
about the pilot.
About the pilots.
Gosh.
So pilots are being told that they cannot rescue the survivors. I mean, this is now, we're 6 days into this, and there's still people who are stranded. And I mean, the time is running short. They don't have food. They don't have water.
Yeah. You know, this brings up some really interesting concerns from the political space. In this continuing resolution that was just passed, which goes through December, we sent more aid to Ukraine.
It's astounding.
We sent billions more of aid to Ukraine. And this is, without getting into a repudiation or defense of American foreign policy, it is not an unreasonable thing to question. Is it American to send resources overseas that we've borrowed versus helping Americans here at home whose lives have been ruined?
Yes.
It's a value judgment. And look, to be very clear, we make value judgments every day. Do I go here? Do I go there? Do I eat at this restaurant? Do I stay at home? Do I let my kids do this or do I do that? We make these judgments all the time. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us very different from the animal kingdom. And that's a unique gift that God has given us. When Americans see that we're sending more and more money that, oh, by the way, doesn't even exist. These are treasuries printed and guaranteed by the U.S. government that are sold as again, and they're tied to our federal national interest rates. That's a whole other matter. But treasuries and securities which are sold on the market, borrowed against, and then sent overseas as equities, cash, or as resources that we don't even have. So we're expanding more debt to help foreign nations in a way when we've got Americans here whose lives have been categorically ruined. I mean, it does bring up a legitimate concern over, wait a second, I thought the role of the federal government was to help American people first.
Yes.
And that's one of the unique things about the whole America First message that came on the scene. And some people have labeled it as, every name under the sun. But let's unpack the political slogan and talk about the principle. Should our wealth and resources be supporting American interest first and foremost? I think every American at the end of the day agrees, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, of course.
It's a priority.
So should we prioritize people in North Carolina and Georgia and Tennessee and many other places that have seen Florida? My parents are in Florida right now. They've got a foot of flooding in their home. So, I mean, we're talking complete disruption of their lifestyle, huge loss of wealth. And there are thousands and thousands of people that have dealt with this. It's not an unreasonable thing for Americans to petition their government saying, hang on a second, why are we sending more aid overseas when we should be helping our own here in the United States?
And they petition and nothing is done. What can be done?
So what can be done is obviously if you know people that are there, ask them and speak with them directly, offer refuge and safe haven to those that are in need. People ask about what's the greatest form of charity. Well, could you take a family into your home if they needed it? And could you give them a warm meal and a comfortable place to sleep with a roof over their head? That's probably the greatest form of charity you could give to someone immediately to meet their needs. But secondly, we need to be petitioning both our state governments as well as our federal government on how our funds are being utilized to hold our public officials accountable when those resources are not being prioritized to those in need. So I would say, call your congressman, call your state senator, call your U.S. senator, all of your public representatives and ask, what are you doing to prioritize those in need versus those in D.C. or in other states? How are we ensuring that resources are brought here? Ensure that congressional hearings are brought about to have oversight of FEMA activities or of other things that might be supporting in a good way or potentially in a ill-conceived or in a mismanaged way. That layer of accountability is something that we're always going to need. And that's something that if you don't take part in the process, you have no ability to redress grievances.
Hearings take time, though.
They do. They totally do.
Did you see that the Tennessee National Guard was deployed to the Middle East like the day of the catastrophe? They have not been recalled, as far as I know.
Yeah, that's a complete imbalance, in my opinion. Yeah, I would recall them immediately.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. I think that they need to prioritize, again, the constituents there. It's part of why the National Guard exists. So I think Americans need to speak the truth. The most important thing is we need to just tell people, hey, we're not okay with this.
Yeah.
This is a misprioritization of efforts, and it's time we focus on Americans. It's time we focus on the needs here in the homeland. And what we see going on in North Carolina, I mean, it's just absolutely awful. I know we've given money to folks in need. We've donated supplies. We have members of our church that go with aid organizations like Christ in Action or Samaritan's Purse or many others, and they support rescue efforts. And so we do our best to be philanthropic to help them. And so we pay for their food, their travel, their lodging. When they go out and they provide resources, they bring in heavy equipment and try to tear down homes that have been destroyed or pull things out of the way so that we can get access to rubble. People could start to rebuild their lives. That's all a process too. But again, we found, ironically, that there are some regulations brought about by FEMA that are now making it more difficult for NGOs to participate in rescue response because of the potential implicated cost. So again, we have to unpack this. We have Americans who are benevolent, trying to help one another. And now they're getting penalized by the federal government for doing so. Something about that seems like it's unbalanced.
Yeah, wrong.
And it's right for us to say so.
You've seen disaster situations before. You've seen pictures and videos of what's going on in North Carolina. What is it going to look like in a year?
Well, I'll tell you what,
What are they in
it's
for?
difficult to say. The sheer mud that's been brought about with the flooding there is just quite categorical. We saw some of that in Puerto Rico. I did response there under Hurricane Maria. And it was a Category 5 hurricane. It was really quite awful. A lot of people wanted to come in and be benevolent and help out. Unfortunately, a lot of them were celebrities that just wanted to park their aircraft at the airport, take photo ops, and weren't actually helping rescue efforts. But I got to work with some of the Marines that were up at Roosevelt Roads and other areas, and we drove throughout the island finding people in Mayaguez and other areas to help rescue them. And that was a great mission. There, very rocky terrain, but very limited infrastructure. North Carolina is a bit of a different anomaly. Having said that, though, Western North Carolina is still very, very rural. So they're going to have to rebuild roads. And in some of that rocky terrain and steep atmosphere and kind of climate, it's difficult to clear out mud. So to be honest, I don't think we're going to see what that area looks like for another 5 years. I think they'll open up roads. They'll probably get commerce going back and forth, but we really won't see, I think, that region land into kind of normal sediment until we see a lot more rainfall and a lot more of a washing away of all this huge amounts of mud and deposit. And it's going to come with people having homes torn down. There are entire towns, I think, that were destroyed. It's really anyone's bet.
5 years?
I would not be surprised at all.
The poor people.
Exactly.
I know Samaritan's Purse is down there. Like that's where their headquarters is, correct? Near there?
I don't know if they're there. They might be. You might be right. But I do know that they have a presence there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, those poor people.
Yeah. The people that have dealt with severe hurricanes, it takes, with how much money our government spends, it's hilarious because I wish we had more accountability of how it goes about. But the people that need aid and care, usually it's a long, hard road. So what you can do right now is if there's nonprofits, I do recommend that people support nonprofits. the federal government's now asking for people to donate.
No way.
And I have serious concerns over donating money again
Not
towards
to
the federal government
Yes.
because we're already taxed, we're already borrowing, we're already sending more
Yes.
overseas.
And they're not doing it. There is
Yeah.
call after call on social media that the government is not doing anything.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're slowing down the process of actual help, which we were talking beforehand. You say, well, there could be reason for that with, too much air traffic
Mhm.
or supplies rotting because they cannot
Right.
be stored correctly.
Right.
But
My recommendation is to almost always use the private market because you'll have better accountability.
yes.
And if there's something if, for example, if Samaritan's Purse was found to have been corrupt and they were misusing funds, we'd find out about it. At some point, it'd be made public.
Yes.
There'd be a lawsuit. Their organization would be shut down and it would cease to continue. When the federal government does it, you don't really hear much.
No.
You don't usually see much accountability. So you can at some areas, but the public officials don't get fired. I mean, look at Lois Lerner with targeting conservative nonprofits at the IRS. She was never formally disciplined. She retired with full benefits. So the federal government has its own kind of carve out from public exemption, which is really unique, which I don't like and I think is completely unfit.
Yes.
I would always recommend that people use the private market because they'll be more accountable and diligent with your funds. And especially that you have friends or family that volunteer to go, find out where they go, find out what group they volunteer with, and go and donate to those groups directly. Maybe it's supplies, maybe it's resources. I know we do a lot of that with our church. But we know the people that are there.
Yes.
We know those funds are not being misused. We know that they'll go towards actually supporting those who are trying to improve the lives of others and actually rescue individuals.
Yes.
And we've still been seeing that now. Some people are being undug and pulled out from rubble and debris. And
Yes.
I pray to God we have much more people that are found because there's still quite a few folks that are missing and it's just terrible.
Yes. And you can only survive just a couple days without water.
That's
I
correct.
mean,
Yeah.
did you see that there was that pack mule company that was taking supplies in with their mules?
I did not. That's awesome.
Yes. It's a mountain
I love
pack mule company
a bunch of hillbillies with mules. I
Yes.
love it. I love it. That's awesome.
because
We
there
have
are no roads.
exactly. We have donkeys, so I'm sure my wife will want me to pick up our donkeys and go on that escapade as
You
well.
should.
We totally
How
should.
many do you have?
We have 5.
Isn't that quite loud?
They are loud. They're noisy. I call them my unemployed narcissists. So they think they are the most important people in the world. But nonetheless, there are therapy donkeys. People ask, what do you do with donkeys? We love them. I don't know. They're rescues. They were going to go to a slaughter and we decided to give them a home and a peaceful life. Because that's what we're like, conservative hippies. We just want people to live free and peaceful and we care for our animals. So I love that people are using mules to go in there. Mules are remarkable animals, horses, mules, donkeys, you name it. And there's indigenous people all across the world that still use pack mules in a very effective way. So I'm not surprised to hear that. I think it's fantastic. And I wish we'd find people just, you don't need some fancy big rig truck. You just need a good animal and
That's right.
a guide who knows the terrain and take your time, be careful and help people.
Right. So how many animals do you have besides you have chickens, you
We
have
do.
donkeys?
We
What
have
else
goats.
do you have? Goats.
Yes.
Do they mow your lawn for you?
No, they're worthless. They're worthless, but they're very loud. So
Okay.
they're cute, but they're completely worthless. So, but we still love them.
Before I ask my final question, do you have any thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I think people are feeling really concerned at what's going on with so much being thrown at you and so much going on in the news cycle, the media, what we're finding internationally, finding domestically, internal politics, economy. I mean, you reach out into the ether, if you will, and pull an issue and you could unpack it for hours. I think at the end of the day, we need to inculcate our culture and our people here with a sense of autonomy and a sense of ingenuity to make solutions. If you don't like the implications, As a Man Thinketh is a great book that I tell people to read all the time, written by a man named Alan. If you're not sure what to do in the future, find a solution and take initiative. And we've really lost so much initiative where people say, well, I can't do that because someone else should do that. Well, why not? Why can't you be the one to make change? When you think about the candlelight revolution in communist Romania that overthrew their government, it started with people holding candles in public squares and vigils. And eventually it overthrew one of the most brutal and dictatorial governments that Europe has ever seen, even to the point where Nikita Khrushchev said, wow, we were bad. The Romanians were worse. It all started with people taking initiative. So don't lose hope. God is good and sovereign in all things. Take initiative. Be effective where you can and be empowered by that. Because I think each human, when we have the opportunity to put our minds together, to take initiative, we can do some compelling and amazing things. And that's where I think we need to go.
Well, that you basically answered my last question, which was if the average American citizen could do one thing to combat the corruption that we see, what would it be?
Take initiative and be a part of the process. And that doesn't mean, oh, I have to run for office. No, not necessarily. I ran for office. It didn't work out.
Well, there's always a next time.
There is a next time. That's true. I've been asked about that, and we'll see. God has a sense of humor, so we'll see what he has up his sleeve. I've also been asked about the possibility of working in the Trump administration or working in the federal government again in another capacity. We'll see. I'm trying to be humble. I'm a public servant at heart. So I want to go where I can serve. So I think each of us need to remind ourselves, just take initiative where we can, when we can, with the resources given. Teddy Roosevelt has a really funny quote. It says, use what you have where you can and impact change. And that's a paraphrase of his quote, but it's essentially use the resources that are put before you and do the job that you know you can do. And so when we take initiative, when we're a part of the process and we invest, we go to our board of supervisor meetings, go to your local health forums. When you find out that your school is having a parent-teacher conference, go to those meetings, engage with your neighbors, talk to people around you, be active in your community. And that's, I think, the only way that we can really inculcate our environment for improvement.
Thank you, Cameron, for
Absolutely.
joining me
It's an
today. It's
honor.
great to see you.
Great to see you as well.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Visit our website where you can sign up for our latest newsletters and become a member of Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.